sort of fallen back to an earlier stage in the dialectic. And each is the same in that respect. So, gamma. Something as it is outside the limit, remember the limit is understood as being between them, the unlimited something is only a Dasein in general. A something. As such, it's not distinguished from the other. It's only determinate being and therefore has the same determination as the other. Each is only a something in general, or each is another, thus both are the same. Which wasn't kind of what we were expecting, because the whole point of limit is that it enables something to be this, not that. It excludes the other. But because it's reciprocal, and in fact falls between the two as the non-being of each, it reduces the two to being the same indeterminate something that lies to either side of the limit. That's one thing. But of course, as we've seen, something can't be just either side of its limit, because it is what it is through the limit. So the limit therefore belongs to the thing, which is why, if we just focus on this for a minute, and we take that away, the limit isn't sort of between, it belongs to the thing. It's ambiguous. It both falls between the two and belongs equally to either side. Because it's not the thing and it is the thing at the same time. So let's now think of the two, not as falling outside of the limit, but as limited. Again, Hegel claims this just reduces the two to being mirror images of one another, being the same. But this, their primarily immediate determinate being, is now posited with the determinus as limit, in which both are what they are, distinguished from one another. Limit, however, is equally their common distinguishedness, their unity and distinguishedness like determinate being. So in fact, the limit as falling between the two and as equally belonging to the two of them fails to distinguish them from one another. Because insofar as they both fall outside of the limit as mere Dasein, they're the same. Insofar as they're both limited, they're the same. So limit is an odd kind of way of distinguishing A from B, because it distinguishes A from B by turning the two into mirror images of one another. And as a consequence of that, Hegel now focuses on the relationship between the affirmative being of something and its non-being. And for that reason, you can sort of forget about the other term, because they are both effectively the same. So what we're interested in now is the relationship between the affirmative being of something and the limit that is that through which it is. And Hegel thinks that there is a particular dialectical relation, as we'll now see. Okay, the Miller text Miller text goes on to say this double identity of both, and he slips an of in there. Of determinate being and limit contains this. That the of should be deleted. Because what Hegel's focusing now is not the double identity of determinate being and limit, but the double identity of something and its other, which are identical in two different ways. A, as determinate being, and B, as limit. So determinate being, or Dasein, the affirmative being, is one respect in which something and its other are identical. They are both the same indeterminate something outside their limit. But the limit is another respect in which they're identical, because they're both the same in not being the other. So determinate being and limit represent two different ways in which something and other are identical. The double identity of both. Miller misses this with just the one word, of. What is this double identity? What is it that they have in common? What is it that's the same in both something and its other? Well, it's this, that something has its determinate being only in the limit, and that since the limit and the determinate being are each at the same time the negative of each other, the something which is only in its limit just as much separates itself from itself and points beyond itself to its non-being, declaring this to be its being, and thus passing over into it. That's a mouthful, I agree. But that's the decisive move, and believe it or not, that's the move in which a limited something proves to be finite. And the thoughts you've got to hold together are this, that something has its determinate being only in the limit. It's only in and through its limit, in being limited, that it is properly something at all. But the limit is the negative of something. It's the not being something. It's the moment of non-being. But that means that something has its being only in its non-being. And so, he argues, logically, something in its being points beyond itself to its non-being as where its true being lies. It passes over, logically, from its being into its non-being. But something understood as passing over from being into non-being is a being that ends. It's a finite being. Again, go back to the idea that you've got something and other, and you've got a limit. And think of the something in two different ways. First of all, as outside of that limit, they're both the same. Secondly, as limited, they're both the same. So focus on the relationship between the something and its limit, which is the same in each case. That relation is twofold. On the one hand, something is what it is through the limit, as limited. On the other hand, the limit is the negation of the something. It's the non-being of the thing. Put those two together, and something must have its being in its non-being. And so its being, as it were, must pass from its being into its non-being. Because paradoxically, in being what it isn't properly what it is. It's only properly what it is through non-being. That, Hegel says, is being finite. Being finite is being in such a way that one has one's being in non-being. That one's being passes over from being into non-being. That we end. And indeed, this is Hegel's claim. To be something is to end. This has nothing to do with time, it has nothing to do with biological mortality, it has nothing to do with other things crashing into us. It's just part of what it is to be something. Every something ends. And it ends because it has its being and its non-being. Now again, unfortunately, Hegel doesn't say any more. That's it. He then goes on in the next, to apply this to the preceding example, he's talking about points and lines. So this won't mean anything to you unless you've read the beginning of the philosophy of nature. It's Hegel's geometry and how points logically become lines, which logically become planes, which logically become surfaces, and it's how he's deriving the three-dimensionality of space. He does come back to the idea at the beginning of the next paragraph, but again, only for one sentence. The other determination is the unrest of the something in its limit, in which it is immanent, an unrest which is the contradiction which impels the something out beyond itself. And then again, he goes on a long ramble about lines and points and stuff. And then the very end of the section, something with its immanent limit, posited as the contradiction of itself, through which it is directed and forced out of itself into finite. So the way to understand this is to think of something which is Dasein, its affirmative being, and then its limit is the moment of non-being. They're clearly different from one another because that's the non-being of something. And yet, it's only through being limited that something is. So insofar as something has its being this side of the limit, that being points beyond and passes over into its limit, into its non-being, in order to be at all. So logically, any limited something is a finite something. Note, though, there's a difference between being limited and being finite. Being limited involved a relationship to something else. So remember, we have here got the relation of something to limit. But limit arose in the first place only because there was something else over here which something excluded. So for Hegel, to be limited is to be this something, not that something. You can't be limited, strictly speaking, all by yourself. But Hegel then showed that the very structure of limit turned the two, something and other, into the same thing. There was no difference between them. So then we can forget about the other for a minute, because whatever we say about this something applies equally to the other. So the relationship that Hegel's now focusing on is the relationship between this something and its limit. It is that that constitutes finitude. So being finite is something you can be all by yourself, as it were. So there is in fact a difference between being limited and being finite, even though the one gives rise to the other. And this is not a distinction that is normally made by a lot of philosophers. Spinoza, for example, doesn't make it. I'm going to make that in the book. For Spinoza, to be finite is to be limited by something of the same kind. But for Hegel, that's not being finite. Being finite is having one's own being in one's non-being, passing in one's being into non-being, in being what one is. Now, of course, Spinoza can't allow that, because to say that would mean that there was an intrinsic direction towards non-being within the very being of something. And that just goes against everything Spinoza believes. So for Spinoza, the only source of the non-being of a thing can be something else. The only something else that can destroy something. So being finite and being limited for Spinoza are the same thing. But they're not for Hegel. Being limited is related to something else. Being finite is a relation to one's own non-being. Note also that there has been no mention here anywhere of the infinite. For Hegel, you don't need the idea of the infinite to make sense of being finite. The infinite will come in, but it's not there at the very start in our understanding of finitude. Finitude arises through being limited. It belongs to being something. And in fact, being infinite will follow from being finite. Again, very different from, for example, Descartes, for whom we can't make sense of finitude except in relation to an infinity short of which we fall. But Hegel, in a way, Hegel's logic does more justice to the etymology. Remember, finite in finite. So the infinite is derivative from the finite in not being it. The finite isn't the in finite. It's not the not finite. Finitude comes first. Right, I'm going to stop at this point. I'm hoping to have a little look at finitude, but I thought this would be a good point to see what you think about it. Obviously, it's covered quite a lot there, but get a sense of what you think about it, what questions you've got about it, if any. I want to start with the MA students, as always. Basically, do you follow the logic? If not, please say, what is it that's not clear, and we'll look at it again. And even if you do follow the logic, what are your thoughts about it? Do you think it works? Is it interesting? Etc., etc. Yes, Beth, yeah.
I was curious as to how it's related to the kind of stuff we find in Heidegger. The kind of, not necessarily big of death, but we have the, he kind of put the idea that Dasein needs to be finite in order for us to kind of make sense of it at all.
Well, it's very close, I guess, actually, yes. I mean, obviously, this is not... I mean, this Dasein already for Heidegger is concerned about its own being. So there are other structures there that aren't in Hegel. But I suppose that what finitude amounts to is a kind of being towards death. Absolutely. And that's definitely the case. That death is not thrust upon us, unlike greatness, death is not thrust upon us by something else. It's intrinsic to being something at all. And so Kierkegaard also coins that, doesn't he, that term, being towards death. And so I suppose, yeah, this is very much it. This is very much it. And this, really, I think, is where you see the, to use a slightly vulgar word, sort of payoff of what we began with. Because right at the very beginning, pure being vanished into nothing, vanished into being, vanished into nothing. So pure being and nothing proved to be inseparable there. Well, here we're seeing kind of what that means. What does it mean for being to be completely bound up with non-being? Well, it means that things die. It means that they end. And they end through their own being. If you could go back to the beginning of the logic and imagine sort of resisting that and say, no, being is being is being is being is being, then where would you go? Well, then you end up with Spinoza, effectively. That then there is no principle of ending within something. Because to be something is just to be something, to be something, to be something, to be something. The only way a thing can end, then, is through the agency of something else. Now, Spinoza does think, in fact, that's how things are. They are bound up with other things, and they do interfere, and they do cause one another to end. But sort of if impossibly they could be kept apart, then there would be nothing in what it is to be something that causes it to end. And so that follows from that more strictly Parmenidean line, whereas Hegel's emphasis here on finitude follows from seeing being and nothing as being intrinsically bound up with one another. So I know it's taken a long while to get there, but now you should be able to see, and in fact, negation will take a variety of different forms. So again, if you look back over this and think the different forms that negation's taken, it was there as simple determinacy. It was there as being for other. It was there as constitution. It was there as limit. Now, it's there in a much more radically and destructive form, as the finitude of thing. But it's all the negative doing its work. But yeah, I think you're right. It definitely parallels with Heidegger. And of course, those of you who've done the phenomenology then will know, the master slave and the role that death plays at various points throughout the phenomenology. It's crucial to various forms of identity. Anybody got any other thoughts about this? Yeah.
From the perspective of natural consciousness, if we're talking about the finite in numerical terms, then we're talking about something that deals in, as well, with discrete packages, atoms. There are natural numbers that can then be divided into further integrations of themselves and so forth. And we can delineate something finite by saying which packages are or are not in the domain we're attacking. Since Hegel devised finitude before infinitude, does he reject that atomic hypothesis for numbers in his mathematics, treatment of mathematics as well?
No, but quantity, as we'll see, probably we tend, is a further development of the idea of infinity. And that's because of the idea of the unit or the one. So Hegel's theory of quantity is built around the thought of the unit, the one and the many. And to be one is not to be finite. To be finite, as you can see, is to pass from being into non-being. But to be one is to have a particularly heightened form of self-relation. In fact, a form that initially excludes any other one, but then also makes other ones necessary. So numbers are finite forms of being one, which is itself a form of infinity. So numbers get more complicated. And I mean, you're in the sphere of quantity there, whereas being finite is a quality of being. So numbers aren't right. I mean, I'm not sure that all natural consciousness necessarily thinks of finitude in terms of numbers, particularly. I mean, it also thinks of terms of people dying. You know, my hamster died. That's what most people think of as being finite, not numbers. So, but anyway, as you've raised the question of numbers, I think numbers are not derivable, and quantity is not derivable sort of directly from being finite. It requires the intermediate idea of infinity, being herself, being one and many, and then further developments later. That's surprising, but cool. Okay. All right. If there's nothing else, let's press on, because I want to look at what he says about finitude proper, at least the beginnings of it. All right. So we're in the section on finitude. The first paragraph is just sort of not really carrying us forward, but it has some interesting ideas. I'm going to skip the first part of C there, and go into the second one and just read this. He says, when we say of things that they are finite, we understand thereby that they not only have determinacy, but their quality is not only a reality, from Dasein, or an intrinsic determination, that finite things are not merely limited. As such, they still have determined being outside their limit. But that, on the contrary, non-being constitutes their nature and being. They have their being in non-being. Finite things are, but their relation to themselves is that they are negatively self-related. And in this very self-relation, send themselves away beyond themselves, beyond their being. They end through themselves. They are, but the truth of this being is their end. And remember, in German, to be finite is to be endlich. Endly, if there was such a word. To be endly. That's what it is to be finite. So that comes over really, really strong here. The finite not only alters, like something in general, but it ceases to be. So being finite is different from just changing. Okay, remember, changing was becoming other, and becoming other, and becoming other, but remaining something. And as we saw with constitution and determination, something can even change its intrinsic being and still remain something. But being finite is ending. And that's it. And its ceasing to be is not merely a possibility so that it could be without ceasing to be, but the being as such of finite things is to have the germ of decease as their being within themselves. The hour of their birth is the hour of their death. Show them how, it's kind of life is just a deferred dying. So that's very important too. You can't separate being something from its ending. To be, if everything we've read is right, is to end. Right, so that's fairly straightforward. I think he even gets a bit poetic there. So then he continues in the immediacy of the finite, just to set out, first of all, what being finite involves. And he notes that finitude is qualitative negation pushed to its extreme. So the thought of the finitude things brings this sadness with it, because it is the qualitative negation pushed to the extreme. It's just an extreme version of that moment of negation we saw back in Dasein. And in this singleness of such determination, there is no longer left to things an affirmative being distinct from their destiny to perish. Right, he goes on to note that he doesn't really put it this way, but in fact, inherent in what he's saying, is there is a sort of contradiction involved in this, because on the one hand, being finite means being in such a way that your being passes directly into non-being. But at the same time, there is a complete opposition between being and non-being at the same time. Because the non-being into which being passes is precisely the non-being of being. So in fact, what's going on here in being finite is beings passing into its absolute opposite. Not into another form of itself, but into its opposite. So, because of this singleness of the negation, which has gone back to the abstract opposition of nothing and ceasing to be as opposed to being, finitude is the most stubborn category of the understanding. This is interesting. So, what Hegel now goes on to look at, and what most of this section is then about, is, in a sense, what the understanding does with finitude. Why is finitude a stubborn category? Well, because it goes one way and one way only. It goes from being into non-being, and then it stops. That's it. It doesn't go back again. Being, nothing, being, nothing, being, nothing. Something is other than this something, which is something other than that, and so they go. Determination and constitution go into one another. But finitude goes one way, from being to non-being. In that sense, it is stubborn. Hartnecked, it has a hard neck. Negation in general, constitution and limit, reconcile themselves with their other. And even nothing, he says, is given up as an abstraction. But finitude is negation as fixed in itself. The finite, it is true, lets it should be itself brought into flux. It is itself this, to be determined to its end, but only to its end. And then again he says, it is the refusal to let itself to be brought affirmatively to its affirmative, to the infinite. Now that idea of being stubborn, refusal, obviously is anthropomorphizing the category, but it's sort of suggesting the idea that finitude goes one way. And the understanding picks up on this, and as it were takes over that moment of stubbornness and refusal, and insists that the finite is finite and that's it. And of course Hegel's got in mind here, rightly or wrongly, what he thinks of as the full ultimate philosophy of finitude, which he takes to be Kant. So remember, this is written in, the first edition was 1812, published again in the 1830s. But it's written against the background of Kant. And Hegel sees Kant, again rightly or wrongly, as a philosopher of finitude who insists on the finite limits of understanding. Yes, we can operate with the idea of the infinite, but we can never, as it were, sort of realize that. That's only a guiding idea, because we're finite, and that's it. We're just finite. So that is a kind of stubbornness that Hegel thinks understanding adopts, but it's almost invited to take up that stubbornness by the category itself. All right, then he goes on, I think I've got time to cover this, to note, though, a sort of paradox that happens then. So, the understanding persists in this sadness of finitude by making non-being the determination of things, and at the same time making it imperishable and absolute. So the understanding absolutizes the finite. Okay, there's something odd there. But that just follows from the very persistence. By persisting with finitude as just that, understanding turns finitude into something non-finite, absolute, unending. The finite is always finite. It never stops being finite. It never ends. The finite, which is to end, never ends. Okay, there's something odd about that. And then you can see he italicizes, it is thus eternal. Then he goes on to say in the next paragraph, this is a very important consideration, but certainly no philosophy or opinion or understanding will let itself to be tied to the standpoint that the finite is absolute. But he knows, obviously, that's not true. In fact, the very opposite is expressly present in the assertion of the finite. The finite is limited, transitory. It is only finite, not imperishable. So what Hegel's arguing here is that finitude is one way. It's only finite, and therefore it's not imperishable. Whereas what understanding is saying is, yes, the finite is only finite, and for that reason is absolutely that, is imperishably that. In the next bit that unfortunately Miller mangles, you see what's at issue. And so what Hegel is going to sort of charge understanding with is not taking finitude seriously. So he says, the point is whether, in thinking of the finite, one holds fast to the being of finitude and cross out the lets, and the transitoriness continues to be, or whether the transitoriness and the ceasing to be cease to be. But it is precisely in that view of the finite that makes ceasing to be the final determination of the finite that this does not happen. So there are two alternatives. You can hold fast to the finite, and so transitoriness continues to be. Ending never ends. Finitude doesn't end because it's always not end, it's always ending. So the lets is particularly unfortunate there because there's no letting going on at all. Or whether transitoriness and the ceasing to be cease to be. And Hegel thinks that is, if like, the logic of finitude is that the finite not only ends, but its ending has to end too. The finite can't be thought as finite if it's thought just as finite. It has to cease being what it is in order to be what it is. What does that mean? It's got to mean that the finite has got to in some way become infinite. Now, we haven't seen how that occurs, and we don't know yet how it occurs. But the logic of being finite requires that. The understanding turns finitude into something imperishable and infinite by persisting with the finite. And there are philosophers who say, there is only finitude. Infinity is an abstraction. It doesn't exist. There is no beyond. There is no absolute. There's just the finite. So what have they done, if not absolutized the finite? So for Hegel, that's not taking finitude seriously. And that's why this is so important. For Hegel, if you stick with the finite, you're not really sticking with the finite. This echoes what we saw earlier. If you stick with becoming as becoming, you're not really sticking with becoming. Because becoming through its logic turns into Dasein. If you stick with finitude as the understanding does, then you're not being honest in your commitment to finitude. Because being honest in the commitment to finitude is allowing ceasing to be to cease to be. Allowing the finite to end, but also to cease being just ending. As I said, this doesn't explain how, in fact, finitude proves to involve infinity. But it shows, Hegel thinks, that the only way to think the finite seriously is to think it in its becoming infinite. And if you stop and say, no, I'm not having to do with the infinite, well then you're absolutizing the finite, so you're contradicting yourself. This is, I think, is a very powerful argument, and it's one of those points where it seems to me Hegel's just right. I can't see any way around this. But the implications of it are very strong. It means we have to let the finite become more than just that if we're going to think it in its finitude. And that's going to mean following it on into the move to infinity. Okay, the rest of this, I think this section is all fairly straightforward. So we've got to finitude. What I'm now going to suggest that you do is read limitation and the ought, but don't spend hours on it. because I will go over it very, and it's fascinating, but we don't have a lot of time, so I want to move on. But do have a look at it. The transition from the finite to the infinite is really important. That's on page 136, gamma, so you do need to look at that. And note, there are two different conceptions of infinity there that arise. Then read into the beginning of infinity, and particularly B, alternating determination for finite to the infinite, is where Hegel introduces the bad infinite. So you have the bad infinite, and then you have what he calls the progress to infinity. So if you could at least read up to about sort of page 143 by next time, that will be very good. That will be the transition into infinity, and then the bad infinite. If you've got time, and you want to go right to the end of the true infinite, then it's possible I might cover some of that next time as well. Thank you very much.